Yeah, so how excited are you about summer? You ready for it? It's coming down. It's coming. Yeah, in Texas, it's always fun, right? It's always a great time. You know, it's always funny to me how you got someone coming from up north and they describe to a typical Texan, they say, we have these things called seasons. So you talk to the Texan, you say, hey, we have this thing called fall. The Texan says, that's kind of funny because we call that sort of summer here. And you say, well, if you're up north, you say, well, we have a winter. Well, that's sort of summer. Then we go back to sort of summer again with tornadoes. Then we go back to summer. So in Texas, that's how it goes. Yeah, so lived here my whole life, so I guess I'm that typical Texan. That's kind of how I see things working here, so it's always fun. But yeah, I'm very happy. This is a very blessed place, by the way. The church is very blessed. And I just want to impart to all of you how blessed you are to be here, be part of God's family, that Jesus provides us a mechanism to gather together and to worship him in full, even with motorcycle sounds, in full passion for his word and for what we do. So I just want to say thank you for showing up tonight, because I will definitely be the poor man's Pastor Rusty. But I think we'll get through it. I think we will, assuming doing this. Okay, so I have something of a controversial topic this evening. It's probably something you wouldn't typically hear, but I think it's important. I really do, because we get this idea about, especially spirituality, and it's really important that we think, okay, people who are spiritual, people who have an idea of what it means to follow God, has to have some type of perception about how they should behave and how they are to view the world. So I've titled this message, I call it The Defense of Stupidity. Okay? And the reason why I'm sort of going down this path is because over the past several weeks, we've talked about the Resurrection Sunday message. Okay? And I've heard the pastor and I've heard other people say, essentially, that the disciples were kind of clueless. They had been told multiple times by Jesus that these things are going to happen. And he repeatedly tells them these things. And so we have to ask ourselves a simple question. What was Jesus trying to accomplish? And was he not just speaking plainly? I would agree that they simply did not seem to grasp the goals he was trying to achieve and would prance merrily down the path of a completely different interpretation. It seems very strange. And yet when we look at it more deeply, we might find there are reasons that maybe they did such a thing. What were those reasons? Why did they believe what they believed? And it's not simply a matter of, oh, they're just stupid. They're just dumb. I don't think that's true. I think there are certain things we have to take into consideration and understand why they sort of had the view that they did. And so maybe through that process, we might be able to understand a little bit better about ourselves, because I think this really speaks more to who we are than necessarily the disciples were and what Jesus was trying to impart to them. So let's just think about what it means for a moment. Before we go into that particular topic, we want to sort of look at something a little further, not quite that far back in time, but maybe a few generations back, in a more recent history. I think this is kind of interesting. It might shed some light on how or why people did what they did and behaved as they did. They say there's a fine line between bravery and stupidity. Is that true? Is that really true? Fine line. I think it is. But what's really interesting, we look at a couple of examples of what that might look like. If I can get this to advance, okay. This is a story of a man who lived a few generations back who exhibited a profound lack of fear, or maybe just another form of stupidity. You be the judge. Murphy. He was born on the 20th of June in 1925 in Kings, a small rural community in Hunt County, northeastern Texas. Maybe you've heard of it. He was the seventh of 12 children born to Emmett Barry Murphy and his wife, Josie Bell Murphy. The Murphys were sharecroppers. What does that mean? Well, if you happen to open the pages of history, you'll see that the sharecroppers, what they did was they essentially worked the land, they grew crops, and they gave a portion of what they grew to essentially the landowner. And they were very poor people. They didn't have much to their name. And they were the descendants of English, Irish, Scottish, and German. So Murphy, as a child, he grew up in this family. He was a loner and had mood swings. They were pretty violent. He grew up around the towns of Farmersville, Greenville, and Celeste, where he attended elementary school. His father drifted in and out of the family's life and eventually deserted them, so father just left. Murphy dropped out of school in 5th grade and got a job picking cotton for $1 a day. $1 a day, right? To help support his family. He also became skilled with a rifle, hunting small game to help feed them. After his mother died of endocarditis and pneumonia in 1941, he worked at a radio repair shop and in a combination of general store, garage, and gas station in Greenville. Hunt County authorities placed 3 youngest siblings and both children home in a Christian orphanage in Quinlan. So that was some of his siblings. So, 1941, that's a notable date, is it not? The attack on Pearl Harbor. He was inspired by this. He was basically a nobody and had no pedigree to speak of whatsoever. But in spite of this, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. But it turns out that he was too young, he was too short, and didn't have the strength to do the enlistment. So he was basically refused. They would not accept him. So what he did was he conducted a form of subterfuge. He talked with his sister, and he was able to fake an ID. And he was able to get into the Army through that method. Okay. Was that brave or was it stupid? But he did it. Who in here knows who this man is? Anybody? No idea. Let me tell you about him a little bit. He became the most decorated soldier in all of American history. Had a vast array of medals and accolades accredited to his name. Even in the face of odds that were against him, he showed a fighting spirit that was unrivaled in his time. Taking out many German soldiers, even when he was alone doing the fighting, he never backed down. He wanted to continue to fight on. He never sought to gain authority, but instead, led by example for others to follow, he was the very example of bravery in his time. And if you look this man up, his name was Audie Murphy, whom I really didn't know existed until recently. But if you read the actual events of his life and what it was like for doing what he did in World War II, when he fought in the European theater, he fought in the Mediterranean. Many times it was like looking at the script for a Hollywood movie. It was so astonishing. He would take on German soldiers by himself and win in more than one occasion. He was also in Normandy, where he stormed the beach and took out over 200 German soldiers. One man. Incredible. So I'll pose to you the question, stupid or was he brave? Brave, would you say? So how do we know the difference between bravery and stupidity? How do we know what that is? Yeah. But that's just the question. If he had been as equally brave as he was and he ended up, as he suggests, dying in the first encounter, will we consider that to be brave or stupid? Even so. To know the difference, it means to ask the question of why do the risky thing to better oneself or to better something greater? What is that difference? What does that mean? Why do we fight? Why do we take those risks? Is it a principle, an idea, or an act of love to defend the lives of others? It means to know, to live, to stand up for what you are willing to die for. So ask yourself a question. What are you willing to die for? It's a hard one, right? It's one thing to say, oh, yeah, I believe in all these things. I believe in this, I believe in that. But when push comes to shove and you're backed into a corner, will you make that same choice? So let me just say this. You know, I heard this story once about a man, I think it was Africa, who had a church, and he had several, as we have here, probably about 100 people in the church. And he got really tired of all the excuses and the complaints in the church about people not liking this and that, and, you know, it just got to be really old. So he concocted a very elaborate scheme. You can imagine what that might have been, right? One Sunday morning, as he was preaching, this gang of hoodlums suddenly burst to the back of the church. They pull out guns, and they say, whoever professes to be a Christian dies. And so the gunman said, okay, everybody that raised their hands, you guys get over here, and the rest of you, you can leave. So the rest left. And after they were gone, the pastor comes back and says, okay, now that we have the real believers, let's start the real church. Really? Maybe church should be something more than just what we do because it's socially acceptable or not, right? We're here in the sense that we sacrifice part of ourselves, part of our time for the good of God and for the love of his people. Maybe that's something we should consider. And I think it takes a certain amount of bravery and courage, well, not necessarily here so much, but certainly in other parts of the world, where just professing to be a believer in Jesus Christ can get you the death penalty. But they still do it. And it should be a lesson to us that maybe what they consider stupidity is something we should consider bravery and something that we should be following on a day-to-day basis. I could be wrong. That's right. And then we might look at the opposite and show that stupidity can be risk-taking for reasons that are not in line with making the world a better place, but instead a place of misery and hatred. How many of us are familiar with this? You know, human history is replete with examples of people being selfish and being, criminals, thugs. That's honestly, most of the time, that's exactly what humanity has been to each other. It's only been recently that we've found ourselves using the principles of the Bible to be able to pull ourselves out of that type of mindset. Let me just say this. We need heroes. We really do. Heroes are stories are about people that do make a difference in this world despite the odds that may have been stacked against them. And let me just say, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people that stood up, that maybe didn't get the credit for that and may have died very soon in that process, are just as valid as heroes, people who did endure. And believe me, God, I believe He acknowledges that sacrifice. You know, the story of Stephen, who was martyred, who was stoned to death. You know, he's only in a few brief chapters. But if you look at the actual text of that story, you realize his sacrifice started it all. It was him. And so because of what he chose to do and said, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to be brave and I'm actually going to say what I know to be true. And he paid for that with his life. And you know what the Pharisees thought? Do you know what the people of the day thought? They looked at him and they said, what a stupid, stupid man. That's the worldly wisdom right there. Stupid. But as I said, we need heroes just like that. Those that have lived in the past who have shown clear acts of valor to stand as examples to us and the young people of today. And it's not advancing. There we go. Men such as Murphy, Edison, Tesla, Churchill, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and those who stood against the institution of slavery, the list goes on and on. It was these very men and women who provided the world with an unbridled reason for liberty and democracy. You know, I've heard it said many times, because I they said, well, the Bible condones slavery. Right? It says it right there in Exodus. No, it really doesn't. God did slavery, and he did free the Jews, the people of Israel, from the shackles of slavery in Egypt. And over the period of centuries, God worked with his people and worked with the people of earth. And us, as Christians, as believers, we were the ones who stood against it, against those institutions. And we said, this is wrong. And I want to tell you very simply, how is it that we believe that slavery is a bad thing? Well, I'll tell you, it's very simple. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How does that completely not invalidate the idea of what slavery really is? I'll tell you what, let's make a very simple pact. I don't enslave you, you don't enslave me. Pretty simple, right? But it took centuries of time for that very idea to germinate and to then come to fruition as an idea for just a brief 200 years ago. Phenomenal. To tame the tyrants of the world, to usher in a new vision based on biblical principles has literally pulled billions out of misery and poverty. Think about that. Billions. Because of the principles that God provided us, that people have stood in defense of. It took the bravery and or stupidity to see it through. with many paying with their lives, but we still did it. And God calls upon us as a church to stand in that same gap. Back to Jesus and his disciples. Jesus, who is the ultimate hero of all, chose to live among the humans that he loved and cherished, even though we showed how ignorant and weak we really could be. The stories in both the Old and New Testaments have an authenticity that is rarely found in literature of that era and even today, which is one of the reasons I strongly believe in the authority of Scripture. It shows that even the human heroes contained in its pages could be fallible, many showing parts of themselves that are not great with acts of sin. Moses with his murder of an Egyptian, David with Bathsheba, Jacob with the deceit of his father, Abraham having a child with his maid, Solomon with his many wives pulling him away from faith in God, Peter with his denial of Jesus, not to mention the other disciples running away when Jesus was arrested. Okay, how about that? Whoa! Okay, I'm going to get this one away from my mouth. Okay, here we go. Is everybody awake now? Okay, awesome. So, I'll try not to overwhelm you here. Which is why we return to the idea of the disciples not wanting to deal with the facts as Jesus told them time after time. The pictures that the writers of the gospel showed of them was hardly one of great admiration. Many times they seem petty and quite unsure of themselves in day-to-day life, and it is easy in hindsight to judge their actions as dumb, when in reality we might be better served by zooming out in context to have a wider view of what was actually happening. You know, I've always found hindsight to be an interesting concept, right? Because it's so easy to judge. Well, I wouldn't have done that. That was stupid, you know. Really? I'll tell you what, think about this. Let's say that someone was assigned to follow you everywhere you went and write down everything you said and did. And then ask yourself a simple question. How much of that recording would be stupid? Would be dumb? How much? I know what it would be for me. It'd be a whole lot of editing on my part. Whole lot. That's exactly right. Yes. So, to be a disciple of Jesus was probably the most stupid, brave thing to do in that time. So what does that mean, to be a disciple of Jesus? What is that? What was it? It probably meant being cut off from family members and invited the hatred of those who embraced the Jewish faith, based on the Pharisaical view. They were also not popular necessarily with the Roman authorities either, so enemies were everywhere. They actually did give everything up to be counted as his disciples. So let's be careful when we judge. And to be honest with you, this is something that people even today have a hard time grasping. The meaning of the sacrifice that Jesus presented before us. And they were encountering it for the very first time. It is notable that Jesus did not recruit the most accomplished or smartest in his land for this role. He chose modest blue-collar types to carry his message. You know, can you imagine the scene, right? A whole bunch of disciples gathered around, and someone says something dumb, like, Jesus, well, you could make me a great man, and I could be serving your kingdom, and, whatever, some petty thing. Some guy walks up to Jesus and says, when you accepted these resumes, what were you thinking? We need to rethink this whole thing because these people are clearly not understanding anything. How does this work again? It is an interesting thought that he chose upon very different criteria than what others might have done. Even so, they blundered about in ignorance, but had the qualities that Jesus was looking for, as was shown in later history. Those 11 men shook the world to its core. Those stupid men that we sometimes judge, even today. Let's look at a few examples where they missed the mark. Here's the feeding of the 5,000. So this is Matthew 14:15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away." And of course, Jesus had his crowds, as he usually did, so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, he said, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And they objected. They said, "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. Jesus answered them with a directive when they asked what the people will eat. You give them something to eat. He clearly expected the disciples to do it. Did they? No, they stood around with their mouths open. They had no idea what he was asking. Couldn't even conceive of it. Because they had the worldly idea of what it means to feed, not the spiritual conception. And you know what? I can't judge them for this because I would have done the same thing. You say, Jesus says to me, "Oh, you can feed them." What? I've got 5 loaves, 2 fish. I'm looking at 5,000 people. The math just doesn't work. The disciples didn't get it, and so Jesus steps in to perform the miracle for all to see. However, it was clear that Jesus wanted them to step in to do it themselves, but they could not understand. What was he asking? Did this seem stupid? Perhaps would any of us have done any better? Jesus is using this as an object lesson on teaching his disciples the truly miraculous nature of his ministry. And so, at the same time when he was feeding the people, he was showing the disciples, hey, mine is a ministry of miracles. And that feeding the people is one of your primary responsibilities, but actually feeding the people with the spirituality that I'm teaching you is what's most important. Man should not live on bread alone. But it was that lesson he was trying to teach them and that they didn't understand. Jesus does this many times, and they slowly get the hint that faith can be cultivated to advance his kingdom. It takes time to change their sinful nature to that of the heavenly. He's infinitely patient with them. This next one's interesting. Next, we have a request from 2 brothers. Mark 10:35. This is a really funny chapter, by the way, or funny story. I just lost it. What happened? Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." Okay. Sure. You can imagine what Jesus was thinking. What do you want me to do for you, as Jesus would say? Probably with a little hint of sarcasm. He asked. They replied,
Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. I have no idea what that is, but okay. That was not part of the presentation, by the way. Okay, so let's understand, what was it these two men were asking? They were saying to Jesus, hey, I want to be in the most prominent position in your kingdom ever next to you. I want to be honored just as you are, Jesus, just right below where you are. Okay, so you could imagine, the other disciples are all around listening to these two guys. They're thinking, why are you, they would ask, how arrogant can you possibly be to request something of that nature? What were they thinking? Well, I'm going to explain it to you. I'm going to try my best. But I can't imagine being another disciples and hearing those words coming out of another disciple's mouth. And then Jesus thinking, I have been teaching you this whole time about what it means to be honored, and you still don't get it. So what was going on? This really does seem brain dead dumb, especially in light of the fact they mentioned this in front of the other disciples, who Scripture says they become very indignant. I think here is a good place to really explore what is going through the minds of these men, based on the biblical and historical context. So let's just think about that for a minute. They were a product of their time. Understanding the worldly interpretation of power and a particular spin on the Jewish Messiah, who was to appear and liberate Israel from the oppressive Roman authorities. So, what did they use as an example of what they thought the Messiah should be like? Who was it? Who was the most prominent example of what they thought the Messiah should be? No. King David. King David. Who God blessed, no doubt. So what was King David like? He was a military man. He went out and he defeated and he massacred tens of thousands. So, they have this in their mind, this perception. They say, well, any Messiah should be at least as powerful as King David, at least, if not more so. Was this truly unreasonable? Was it really unreasonable to believe this? They assumed that once Jesus assumed the Messiahship, that it was a lock on his using his powers to establish his kingdom, just as David did at that time. And as a consequence, they would have prominent positions as his disciples in that kingdom. That wasn't God's plan, but that's what they read into it. The Messiah was going to be like King David. And that meant bloodshed, massive amounts of it. How did any given king establish his authority? He went in and he murdered. And that's exactly what they believed. And they thought, okay, I want to be a part of this kingdom, man. I just want to be like King David, where he had his entourage that surrounded him at all times of the day and night. Says, and that's exactly what the sons of Zebedee believed. They want to be part of that kingdom and be a part of what Jesus wanted to do, because they truly wanted to hear that Messiahship would establish as King David would. And you know what? I think if I had been living in that time, in that era, I would have believed the same thing, without a doubt. So, when Jesus sits down with them, and he tells the disciples, hey, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be tortured, have a horrible death on a cross. Is that really what the disciples wanted to hear? No. They didn't want to hear that. You are not that. In fact, many disciples denied it. How does that make sense? How is it possible that a Messiah, as King David, would willingly lay down his life and die a horrible death at the hands of the enemy? That's nothing like King David. Nothing. So they did the only thing they thought they could do. They completely ignored it. They knew that he did great miracles, even brought back the dead. How could one deny his messiahship? He forgave sin. He was literally God incarnate. There is no way he's going to die. He is the master of life itself. How is it possible he would die? That meant they only wanted to hear about the glory of the coming kingdom and what great things they could do within it. Now, Jesus, back to the story of the sons of Zebedee, he didn't answer them with rebuke. How did Jesus answer the sons of Zebedee? You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup of judgment that I will partake of? And they had no idea what he meant. None. And they just said, they blurted out, oh, I can do it. I can do it, God. Yes, I can, Jesus. Really? They had no idea. None. Because they thought that meant glory. But it just confused them. They didn't grasp it. Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism am I baptized with? We can. That's what they say. They had to answer it because they had no idea. Because it would mean they had to accept a fate that they dared not think about in light of this. I do have a little more sympathy for their position. Because who wants to be told that to establish the kingdom that you want to be so desperately a part of, you have to die a death that's so horrific you can't even conceive of it? So be a little more careful when you think about these men and about where they're coming from. I think it's useful to remember that Jesus was putting the priority on a spiritual kingdom that has to precede the worldly. Satan has an ownership of the earth that has to be broken, and there has to be a true path to salvation for mankind itself. The Jews had no such concept as true salvation. They didn't have it. The only thing they had was the land, and that was the promise that God gave them. But there was no spiritual salvation from the Jews. But the land and the laws could not save mankind. If Jesus had been king like King David and overthrew the Roman authorities, that would have accomplished nothing. Only through the path of the torture and death on the cross and the subsequent resurrection could real reconciliation take place between man and God. And they didn't understand it. And still don't. Still don't. His vision was much bigger than just an occupied land, but an occupied earth and its hell-bound people. I think it is asking too much for the disciples to grasp what Jesus meant when he tells them the truth of his fate. The thought that their Messiah would suffer and die at the hands of both the Jews and the Romans would be inconceivable to them, as it was even to the centuries that followed, where people then go and still don't understand what it means, but supposed great and powerful men of history pale in comparison to the true power of that one moment in time. In all of them, only one tomb stands empty. What's interesting to me is if you go to places like Egypt and you find these massive pyramids of Giza, right? What are those actually monuments to? They're to these kings that anticipated resurrection and continuing their life, that death, not even death, could hold them. But you know what? Every one of those Egyptian tombs contains a body. None of them achieved it. But it took a humble human from a backwater place that nobody cared about to show us the true way. And it wasn't in the halls of Rome or the other places of grandeur that existed in antiquity. None of those places held the true meaning of what it means to be a real person and following what Jesus taught us to be. Even the supposed intellectuals of the day failed to understand the day of these events, preferring instead to maintain their grip on power and ignore anything that might threaten an establishment. The last example is of Peter, his refusal to accept what will happen to his Lord, even boasting of how he will defend to the death against the forces of the Romans and the Pharisees. Mark 8:3-1. Okay, what happened here? He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. He didn't speak in parables. He didn't, riddles. He spoke very, very simply. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." He said, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So Peter himself had that very same thought. He said, "No, God, you're God. And in fact, when Jesus asked Peter directly, "Who am I?" and Peter answered truthfully, he said, "You are the Son of God." And yet, within moments, he says this, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus rebukes Peter, and when Peter tries to rebuke him and calls Peter Satan, it's pretty strong. And Peter's probably confused by this since he thinks that being valiant to protect his Lord is the right path. He was trying to do the right thing. Lord, I'm going to protect you. This is not going to happen to you. I'm going to stop it. He really wants the Messiahship just as the others do. And it is detailed very specifically how he responds when Jesus is taken away to be crucified, crying bitterly after denying Jesus. It is notable how all of the disciples are completely flummoxed by Jesus' death. They heard Jesus say many times how he would rise again on the third day, and they simply could not accept that truth. How many times did he tell them that? They were demoralized and in hiding when the news came that the tomb was empty. None of them, emphasis none, were waiting expectantly for this to happen. This only shows how deep the belief that they chose to see was to them. None. And in fact, if you go to the scene of the crucifixion, how many people were there? The Bible will record, in theory anyway, that were saying, yes, this is supposed to happen. I believe this is exactly what Scripture says is going to happen. Nobody. Even his closest people, Peter, the disciples, nobody anticipated that. even though he said many times over. After Jesus appeared to them many times and truly established his life after death, did they come around to the real truth that Jesus was telling them all along, that his death and resurrection was needed for them and the whole world? And change the world they did, all of them, heroes who fought and died bravely for their Lord and Savior, never denying his truth. So let's be a little humble when we condemn these men and women of faith as they go about their journey being fallible, making mistakes, and then coming around to be the people that Jesus knew them to be all along. How much does this also apply to us? So, as I said, I think it's easy to condemn and believe that they were clueless. I don't think that was the case. They were desperate to find meaning and contextualize what Jesus was saying to them. And if you think about it, if I put myself in that position, and I'm seeing this man go into tombs and raise people from the dead, you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking I never have to die. Because you know what? If I'm close to this man who's God, I'm going to stay with him forever, and I never have to deal with the consequences of death. That's what I want to believe. That's what I want. And I want a position of power within that. And if I believe in this man, you know what that means for me is because I can be a powerful person within that kingdom. And I never have to die. Do you think you could resist that kind of temptation? I'm not sure that I could. So anyway, that's the end of what I'm want to say, but yeah. So if any of you have thoughts, in your own hearts about what God, what Jesus intends for your own life, then pray about it. This is what this church is for. We're here to be there for you, no matter what you're facing, no matter what challenge you have. And believe me, I can attest to this. I've been facing my own challenges recently. But that faith is unwavering, and God will always be there for you, no matter what. So no matter what that is, keep running to him. And even though we have the fallibility that maybe the disciples exhibited, it doesn't matter, because God still loves you, just as he loved the disciples, despite how stupid they were. But they learned. They did eventually, just as we do. Thank you.